look at this next example that I'm done. Here we go. I've got x squared minus 10x plus 1. X squared minus 10x plus 1. Let's go through the steps. First step, I'm going to check the concavity. So the coefficient of x squared is just minus 1 here. I've got a minus sign that tells me, and there's no number, that tells me it's minus 1. This is negative, so if it's negative, it's going to be concave down. So the graph is going to look like this. It's not going to be like the two parabolas that we've done so far. It's concave down. It's facing downwards. Okay, so that's that first step. The second step, the Y-intercept. So I want to check the Y-intercept. Now the sneaky trick that I taught you was that we just look at the constant term at the end. So here it's going to be plus 1. So I'm going to write f of x. If you notice there's f of x here, it's not y is equal to. So I'm going to keep some consistent, going to keep my notation consistent with what the question has. So I have f of x is equal to 1. Okay, the third part that I said we had to do was we had to complete the square. So completing the square. And I'm going to shorthand it, complete the square. Now if you have a look here at my function, I actually have f of x is equal to negative x squared minus 10x plus 1. My x squared term has a negative, it is not a monic. It is not. So what I'm going to actually do first is I'm going to take out a numerical factor so that it makes my x squared just an x squared here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take out a minus 1. By taking out a minus 1, I'm going to actually change the sign of all the terms in my equation here. So by taking out that minus 1, I've got my negative x squared becomes an x squared inside the bracket. Then I get a plus 10x because that minus 10x becomes positive, and that plus 1 becomes minus 1. Okay, cool. Now that I've done that, I'm going to look at the x coefficient. And when I look at the x coefficient, I'm going to halve it and then square it. So here I've got that 10. So I'm going to write it off on the side here. So I'm going to do 10 over 2 squared. Now 10 over 2 is just 5. So that gives me 25 when I do that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert this 25 inside the bracket here. I'm going to insert it inside the bracket. So I've got negative x squared plus 10x plus 25. And when I add it, I also need to do that minus 25 so it makes sure it balances. I still got that minus 1 in the end. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to group the first 3 terms inside my bracket. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some square brackets. So here why I'm using square brackets is because if you notice I've already got another set of brackets. I just want to differentiate the two just to make sure I'm keeping the same groups together. So here inside the square brackets, that is a perfect square. So I'm going to just end up getting x plus 5 all squared minus 26 from outside the bracket. And now that I've done that, I'm just going to put that negative sign back into my whole equation. So here I'm going to have negative x plus 5 squared. What I've done is I've changed up the brackets. Now that I no longer need the 2 brackets, I'm just going to change it back to my regular brackets. And then that negative also goes to that minus 26, so it becomes plus 26. And that gives me that the vertex is at where? Vertex is at negative 5, 26. Negative 5, 26. Okay, we've done that step. Now what I'm going to do is my 4th step, I'm going to check for X-intercepts. So check for X-intercepts. And so how I do that is I'm just going to let this thing over here be equal to, I'm going to let that equal to 0. So here I'm going to write down, if I can move my thing, so I've got minus x plus 5 squared plus 26 is equal to 0. Okay, here we go. Let's solve this equation. So the first step I'm going to do is I'm going to move that plus 26 over to the other side. So I'm going negative x plus 5 all squared is equal to minus 26. Now I'm going to deal with this minus sign. So I can't just take the square root yet. I need to get rid of that minus sign. So I've got x plus 5 all squared is equal to 26. Now if I'm trying to find the square root solution of this thing here, because it's an x plus 5 all squared, I need to take the positive and negative roots here. So I've got plus or minus square root 26. X plus 5 is equal to that. And the final step, so here I'm going to have x is equal to minus 5 plus or minus square root 26. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to check and put these values into a calculator. Now I've already done this in advance. The reason why I want to put these in the calculator is just so that I know roughly where these roots are, or these x-intercepts are. So if I do negative 5 minus square root 26, that is roughly negative 10. And when I do negative 5 plus square root 26, that's roughly 1. And so this roughly tells me where these two roots are, these two x-intercepts are on my Cartesian plane. So once again, I'm just going to look at all this information and I'm going to actually graph it on a Cartesian plane. I'm going to put all this information together. Now, in terms of positioning my Cartesian plane, my vertex, if you notice here, is at negative 526. So I'm going to shift it to the right again. I'm going to shift that y-axis a little bit to the right. So I've got y and x. I know that my x-intercept is going to be... actually, let me go back a step. I know it's concave down. So I know this graph is actually a... Oh, goodness. I know this graph is a concave down graph. So it's going to look downwards. I know where my y-intercept is. It's roughly at 1, somewhere around here. And I know where my x-intercepts are. So I've got one which is at negative 5, roughly negative 10. And I've got one at roughly 1. And I've got my I've got my vertex somewhere in the middle over here. Now, I'm not going to put this information down yet. That was just so that I can picture where it is. Now that I've got that information, I'm going to draw my parabola. I'm going to do that first and then I'm going to label. So here we go. I'm going to go like this, got a vertex, go down here. And I think that might be my most pretty parabola yet. I don't know, give me a second just to admire it. Okay, I've had my moment. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to label all my important information. Let's start from the top. Concavity, let's not worry about that. My y-intercept, where was my y-intercept? My y-intercept was at 1. Oh, let me draw that a little bit better. Back. And I'm just going to erase that little green mark. Ooh, wasn't meant to erase that. Here we go. So I've got my y-intercept is at 1. I've got my vertex is at negative 526. So here, the vertex up here, that value is 26. That is negative 5. So here I'm going to have negative 26. I'm just going to write that down just to make sure. Okay. And then from there, I've got my two x-intercepts. So my first one over on the right-hand side is negative 5 plus square root 26. So it's roughly around where 1 is. And here on the other side, I've got negative 5 minus square root 26. And so there we go. Now, in my parabola, I've already got more than 3 points. So I know that this is the correct parabola. So we're all good. So I'm going to label it at the bottom here. So I've got y is equal to negative x squared minus 10x plus 1. Okay, cool. So once again, here are the 4 steps that we did to graph this parabola. So check the concavity, find the y-intercept, then we complete the square to find the vertex. And then once we've done that, we're going to check for the x-intercepts and whether or not they exist. So if you need to go back and have a look at these 2 examples and slowly go through it, feel free to. And if you have any questions, post it on Google Classroom, send me an email or send a message on send a question through the